Most veterans think it's impossible to get 100% permanent total, but they're wrong. It is very possible, and it takes two things: strategic math as well as evidence. From a strategic math standpoint, it requires you to understand your disabilities and how mathematically they equate to 100%. And in today's example, I'm going to show you exactly how we've been able to use strategic math for the last 10 years to ensure veterans get the most out of VA claim. So here's our glass. Glass one, glass two. Glass one is you, the veteran. You started 100% of a whole body. And then here's your VA claim, start at zero. So let's say, for instance, you're awarded 50% for migraines. So 50% is you from the VA. Here. 50%. So now you have 50% of the whole body and 50% of work from the VA. Let's say, for instance, the VA then awards you 10%. So here's your whole body, and here's your VA percentages. 10% from here is going to your VA percentage. For most people, 50 plus 10 equates to 60%. And for VA math purposes, it equates to 55%. Here's how the math breaks down. So 50% is your rating plus your 10% equates to 55%. The VA subtracts 10% from a whole body. 50% minus 10% is 5. That's 45 and not 55. So your actual VA rating is 55%, but because the VA rates in increments of 10, they round up to 60%. So congratulations, you've been awarded 10%, let's say for instance for tinnitus. So the VA adds a 10% evaluation to your other disability of the 50% for migraines, which equates to 5 points. So now you're at 55%. And then they subtract 5 points from your whole body perspective, which leaves you with 45% left of whole body. That equates to 55% raw score based on 38 CFR 4.25. For most veterans, this can be a little confusing, but the VA rounds up to 60% because ratings are in increments of 10, not 5, not 1, not 7, but 10. So this 55 rounds up to 60. If the math was different, and you were at 54%, it'll round down to 50% as far as your VA rating is concerned. Let's do one more example. Glass one, glass two. Let's say, for instance, the VA now awards you 50% for mental health. So here we are, of the 50%, and this is 50% of the whole body that's up into now your new rating of plus 50%. So let's do the math.
You need something?
Math, cap letters. So congratulations, you've now gotten a 50% for your mental health condition. Now the VA will take 50% from 45, that's 22.5. They add it to the 55% you already have, which brings us to 77.5. So for VA rating purposes, a 77.5 goes to 78 and it rounds up to 80%. So now you're 80% raw. So most veterans look at this number, well, they may not see this number, but they look at their rating, which is 80% now, and they say, I'm only 20 points away from getting 100%. And that can be furthest from the truth. And it's definitely misleading because most veterans feel as if I get a 10 for my back and a 10 for my feet, I'm at 100%, and that is not the case. Let's break this down a little bit further. So now the veteran comes to our firm and they ask, well, how can you guys get me to 90% or 100% or what's there? First, two things are important: evidence and strategic math. Those two things combined helps us help you. We need 23.5 points, or let's just call it 25 points, to make sure that we can service you as a veteran. Where do we find that at? So we already know we have 50% for migraines, which is the most you can get based on the scheduled ratings. We have another 50% for mental health, which the most you typically get for this condition is 70%. Mental health rates at 0, 10, 30, 50, 70, 100%. It's off the top of my head, sorry. So typically most veterans can obtain 70% for this condition. We do have a few veterans that fall in the 100% category for mental health. Well, let's just say 70% is pretty much 3/4 of the population. You've come to us and you're trying to maximize the most out of your claim. And you're trying to figure out what type of strategic math and evidence will work in your favor to use these numbers to get you to 100%. So let's walk through it. 50% for migraines, 10% for tinnitus, another 50% for mental health, which brings us to 80%. Where is the growth? So we look at your evidence and strategic math to make sure that these numbers align with the VA's requirements to ensure we get 100%. So one thing we could do is increase the mental health. Let's say, for instance, we did that, and now you're at 70%. Let's do the math. Okay, so we've increased the mental health to 70%. So we take a little bit of water, add it over here, 70%. So now 70% from 45 is 31.5. You take 31.5, bring it over to this whole body, this rating perspective from a whole body to a rating perspective. And now your bottom line is 86.5. So in the prior example, you were 77.5, which is 80%. Now with the increase of for mental health from 50 to 70%, you're now at 86.5, which equates to 87%, which means you're rounded up to, you guessed it, 90%. You're correct. So some veterans will also believe, wow, I'm that much closer, I'm at 90%. All I need is an extra 10. That's wrong. In this scenario, you need 13.5 points. So let's go find it. The veteran comes back to us, says, hey, oh my God, I'm 50% for migraines, 10% for tinnitus, 70% for mental health. I'm 90%, 86.5, 90%. Where is the other 10? We have to strategically use two things. Do you remember? You put it in the comments. What is it? Strategic math and evidence. Absolutely. North and south, north and south. So how do we find the other 10, or in this case, almost 50% for our client to make sure they can get to 100%? So we go back to the drawing board, we think, okay, 50% for migraines is maxed out. We can't use that. So don't touch it. Because if you ask for an increase, it can be reduced because it's already at its maximum capacity. Well, we can use tinnitus. Well, that's already gone. We're at 10% for tinnitus instead of its maximum rating schedule. So you can't use that. You can also be potentially reduced because you asked for an increase for something that cannot be increasable because it's already at its maximum capacity. Well, 70% for mental health, you can increase that. Yes, technically you can, but you have a very high burden of proof to get 100% for just mental health alone. So I would highly encourage you not touch that unless the evidence is substantiated and overwhelming that there is enough for 100% for mental health. So I would keep 70% where it's at. Well, we also have some other things that we may not have discussed before. So what about knees? What about back? What about hips? What about hyperthyroidism? What about flat feet? What about the fingers? You can get a rating for each finger. There are so many different things that we can look at your medical records and substantiate that will cause you to get an increase in your claim. There's also things called secondary claims. But for the sake of today's conversation, let's make it simple and easy. And let's just say, for instance, we're going for the back. And we get 20% for the back. Let's add up the back. Okay, 20% for the back. I'm going to take 20% from what's left. So minus 20%, just here. So you take 20% from 31.5, which that math equates to 6.3. 20% of 31.5 is 6.3. You add that to the 86.5. So plus 6.3, 5 plus 3 is 8. 6 plus 6 is 12. Carry the 1, that's 9. You are now at 92.8. Let's go ahead and whoop, almost there, but not quite. 92.8, which rounds to 93%. Guess what? You're still 90%. So, oh my God, like, why am I still 90%? Oh. So then we come into two more things: strategic math and evidence. So where else can we find more points for our client to make sure he or she gets to 100%? In this case, we're at 92.8. So we need 3.2 points. Let's call it 5, just for the sake of argument. So where can I find one more condition that's 10%? What do you think, group? What do you think, chat? Put it in the chat. I'm going to say more than likely, we can probably go after the knees. We can get at least one knee, the left knee. Let's go for it. The left knee, 10%. So we're going to add 10%. Excuse my handwriting, but here we are at 10%. We're going to take 10% from 31.5. Well, we got to take 20% from that. So 1 second. So you take 20%, 11 from 31, you have 11.5 left. The 10% from over here, so minus 10, that actually equates to 1.15. The math is ridiculous here. The VA really, once you get to 90%, getting to 100% is like climbing Mount Everest. It's just clawing one hand, 1 foot after another, strategically putting yourself in a position where you don't dehydrate yourself and you win climbing the mountain. And I'm going to show you how to win and climb the mountain. All right. So 1.15 is where we are. We bring the 1.15 over to 92.8 plus 1.15 is 93.9. So even with a 10% VA rating, you're left with 11.5% whole body. This is 11%. And now you have 93.9. That's 94%. You're still not 100%. So now we have to think, well, what could work next? We need one more 10 to go over the hump. So now you do the other knee. Now let's say, for instance, that's 10% as well. So let's go for it again. 10%, 10%. So 11.5 is where your whole body's at, minus 1.15. You have 10.35 left of whole body. That's this. And you're at 93.7, which is this. So you're almost at 100%. Now I'm going to take 10.35 and minus 10%, 9.35. And that will come over here. You will get 10% of 9.35. That's basically 0.9 to 1 point. Boom. So now you're at 95%. Now you're winning. If there's any mistakes in here, I apologize, but I'm sure there isn't. But this is the long version of a very complex process that we saw. But if you can find a way to get to 95% raw score using this logic, 95 rounds into what? You guessed it, 100%. And you'll be 100%. Here's the trick. If you're 100% and it's just 95%, you can run the risk of not being permanent in total. Meaning that if one of these conditions were to get reduced, let's say for instance the knee, it would bring you back to 90% or 93 point, whatever that was. Well, let's say for instance you have another condition. Let's say for instance pes planus, and you're at 30%. Now you are at 96.7% or something to that effect, some math like that. If that one condition of, let's say the knee gets reduced, then you're still at 100%. Then that's how you get permanent total. So the secret sauce here to 100% is two things once again: strategic math and evidence. But 100% permanent total requires you to have conditions that if one of them were reduced and if you remain 100%, then of course it's permanent total. So now we've strategically worked out the math with the evidence, and now you're 100%. For some people, that's congratulations, and for others, it's 100%. But we're going to take a report of that. So cheers to your success. And of course, anytime you need us, we're one click away. Right here, right here, right here, or wherever you're watching, say on your iPhone, desktop, or iPad. Let's win.